world you are. This is Wim Bakens. I am Secretary General of CIB. I will be the convener for today's first webinar in the series of 4 Resilient Cities webinars that CIB and UNISDR are jointly organizing. The 4 are about today enabling risk through urban planning, tomorrow engaging multiple stakeholders, Thursday our webinar in Spanish, and Friday the last webinar on the self-assessment tool for local government. Do know that all webinars will be recorded. After we have had our series, we will send a message to all panelists and all attendees saying where they can find, visit and listen to all recordings. There will be kind of a short summary with hyperlinks to all those recordings that you can forward to whoever you think should be interested in this outcome. Our first webinar today is about urban planning and how it can help to reduce risk from disasters. After a short introduction, we have planned 4 speakers: Cassidy Johnson, Murad Balamir, Fatma El Malla and Susan Houston. All 4 will have a approximately 15 minutes presentation where you can see their slides and hear their talks. After that, we will have a 20 to 30 minutes session with questions and answers. I'll come to that. Today's webinar, as said, is about urban planning. We will address main constraints and barriers. We will focus on informal settlements with their special issues. We will present good practices. We will show how a multi-stakeholder perspective can help. And we will address possible gaps in knowledge to be addressed through research. During the presentations, you can ask questions. Go to the right lower corner of your screen, you will find a chat symbol. If you open that, you can select to whom to send a question. Select me, Wim Bakens. I will keep track of all the incoming questions, and either immediately after the presentation or preferably at the end during that Q&A session, I will read questions and ask selected presenters to give a response. Those presenters themselves will in principle not see the questions, so I have to see them, address them to me. If you want a certain speaker to be addressed, mention his name. If you want your own name of that, or of your organization, of your country to be addressed, include it in the texts. Sending a question is simply by typing the question and then hitting the return button. Now, our first speaker is Dr. Cassidy Johnson. Cassidy is from the University College in London. She is also the coordinator of the CIB Task Group 63 on disasters and the built environment, the platform within CIB where we address this issue. Her presentation will be about planning regulations and how those impact on disaster risk reduction, both in the formal and the informal urban environments. And she will reflect on 5 urban case studies. Cassidy, I'll make you the presenter, and that means the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Wim, and thank you for everyone who's here listening. Just before I start, I'm the one who's put together this particular webinar on planning, and I just wanted to just say that there'll be a few outputs. As Wim said, this will be publicly available for everyone, both on the CIB and UNISDR websites, and that the outputs, or this webinar, is also contributing to a research roadmap that we're doing within CIB on hazards in the built environment, which will be presented at the CIB World Congress in Brisbane in next May. And also it's contributing to the first report of the UNISDR's Making Cities Resilient campaign, which is being done over the next few months. and will be launched at the World Urban Forum in Naples. And finally, we're organizing also at the World Urban Forum in Naples a session on challenges of urban planning for a disaster-resilient future, which is going to be held on the 4th of September, and that what the outputs from this will feed into that and to the elaboration of a collaborative research project on this topic. So if you're interested in any of these, please do get in touch. So what I'd like to talk about today is looking at the formal and the informal city and how planning regulations and planning is being implemented. This is a picture of Dhaka, which is in the foreground, the Korail district, which is an informal settlement in the quite a central area of the city in Dhaka in Bangladesh. And as you see, the more formally built city in the background. This is a city that has very high risk both to earthquakes and frequent flooding events. So there are lots of issues here. Just to give the overall background for this, I think one reason why planning, urban planning and disaster risk, I see them as important. One is that there is projections of urban growth, especially in low and middle income nations and especially in Asia. If you look at the third line down, the purple line in the graph, this is looking at urban growth, particularly in Asia. And the yellow line above that being urban growth in low and middle income nations. And therefore, as urban growth occurs, safe land on which to build and safe building practices are very important. For example, in Istanbul, it's estimated that 100,000 housing units per year are being added to the city, and we see many, many cities like that across the country, or across the world, that there's incredible amounts of building happening. There are many challenges regarding planning, and just to highlight here what this slide shows is that the UNISDR's Global Assessment Report, which came out in 2011, countries report on their progress in managing different areas of risk based on the Hyogo Framework for Action. And this diagram here shows what countries have reported in terms of progress on urban and land use planning, both in 2007, 2009, and 2009 to 2011. And what it shows very drastically is that lower middle and low income countries have not made significant progress on trying to implement urban and land use planning that accounts for disaster risk. So these are countries that are reporting high-level progress, that is significant achievements in incorporating planning and disaster risk. The Global Assessment Report also identifies that there are particular difficulties. One is developing appropriate urban plans that account for risk, so the incorporation of risk in urban planning. How to deal with existing vulnerable settlements, so vulnerable settlements that have been built up over time in our cities over many years, how to manage the risk there. How to enforce urban plans and also building codes when they have been developed. And fourthly, the political will to make risk reduction a priority within urban development and urban planning. So this is what the Global Assessment Report has identified as major issues in planning. Contributing to that report, I did a paper with a number of people who inputted on case studies, and this was one of, hundreds of background papers that were done for the Global Assessment Report. And this paper looked at creating an enabling environment for reducing disaster risk. And was based on 5 case studies, one on Istanbul in particular, another on Turkey more in general, third on Namibia, fourth on Argentina, and fifth on Iran. So over the next few minutes in this presentation, I'm going to draw on these case studies and this paper that I did as a contribution to the Global Assessment Report to bring out some of the issues in planning that I see. not all of this paper was about planning. Some was about building codes and building standards, which I won't go into much detail on here, although they're linked. But basically, I see that there are two main issues that are interlinked. They're not they're not separate, but that there's urban planning to reduce the future risk in cities, that is, cities that are going to be cities as they are developing in the future, and urban planning to manage existing risk in cities. And so one is about planning for the future, and the other is about how do we deal with what we have now. In planning for the future, we need consideration of hazard risk areas, areas that are safe for development and areas that aren't safe, safe construction of buildings and infrastructure, and affordability and access for the poor into urban environments. Because what we're seeing more and more in this very strong land markets that we have in many cities is that the poor basically have no place in the city anymore. And are forced to live in very unsafe places because people want to live in the city and need to live in the city, so they are forced to live in very unsafe places, and this is creating a lot of risk. And then the second is to manage existing risk. How to manage existing developments in hazard-prone areas, informal settlements, how to deal with unsafe buildings and infrastructure. So I'm going to make three particular points here in this presentation. One is about multi-level risk governance and what is needed for that in terms of looking at planning. That's kind of a complex term, but I'll break it down into a few things that I see are important. How to develop access to safe and affordable land in urban areas, and I'll give a couple of examples of what's been done in other places that's interesting. And about managing risk in informal settlements, particularly how to reduce vulnerability there. So first of all, looking at multi-level governance, what the study that across these 5 case studies and also other literature that I've looked at have shown is one is the need for regional level coordination across metropolitan areas or across physical regions. For example, floodplain management of entire floodplains, and I'll go into that. Also the need for multiple stakeholders, and there's a lot of discussion about that, but we'll have actually a session on that tomorrow, more particularly, but that's really important for planning. Different departments, the private sector, and communities, and how everyone is integrated, particularly into the planning process. And seeing laws and planning as strategic rather than reactionary, and I'll give an example on that. And of course, the need for integration. Particularly if we look at this area in northern Namibia, which one of my colleagues had written a case study about flooding that happened there in 2009. A very, very serious flood that stayed over this whole north region of Namibia for many, many months. And they wrote about about how people have coped with the floods. But one of the areas is that there's one of the things that came up in this case, and we see a similar thing, for example, in Dhaka, or not in Dhaka, in Bangkok, is that there's very much a need for regional flood management. For example, these 2 towns, Odangwa and Oshakati, have had plans for managing the flood in their own areas, but nothing to deal with the whole floodplain. As you can see in the map, it's a whole floodplain region. And in fact, Odangwa actually had created a drainage channel that actually increased flooding in another village. And this is very, very common, for example, also in Bangkok, where the flooding in the north of Bangkok exacerbated because trying to control the floodwaters coming into Bangkok, into the city. Another example of the need for having a more strategic approach to laws and planning comes from Buenos Aires, the province of Buenos Aires in Argentina, where a number of laws were created over time in reaction to floods that happened in 1957 and in 1977, regulations about the production of urban plots. Quite strict regulations about how far they had places had to be away from streams and canals, and this is very prescriptive type of zoning regulations. and land use development regulations and the size of plots, etc. And what happened with this was this made the cost of urban land very, very high, and that many people could no longer afford to buy land within the province, and that this put people into having to live informally rather than being able to purchase land. So there was a lot of issues with regards to informally developed areas that came out of these kind of laws, which has an implication on risk. Secondly, moving on to look at access to safe and affordable land in urban areas. I think there's really a need for innovative solutions in to recognize the inequality in access to urban land, the need for flexibility in land tenure arrangements, and the possibilities of communal ownership. Another example from Namibia that has come up both in the literature and in the case study was in Windhoek, which is the capital, and there's a very innovative program that was developed in conjunction with the municipality and the Shack Dwellers International and the local communities there represented by Shack Dwellers to change the ownership structure for land so that people could actually buy either hold very small plots of land so that people could actually afford to buy them, or there could be communal ownership on plots of land. And this has made it possible that people are able to access land in a much more secure way, having security of tenure and formal ownership, which allows them to regulate the type of development and the place where people are living, etc. In this particular situation, there was no value placed on the land, and the municipality was interested only in cost recovery. So this isn't necessarily indicative of what other cities can do, where landowners, municipalities, Crown property is seeking to make money off of the land. In looking at managing risk in informal settlements, there's a number of issues that are coming up in cities across the world, and I'll deal with it very, very briefly here, but I think this is something that really requires more research and more action on. This is the location of people are living in hazard-prone areas because they don't have access to safer areas within the city, living on floodplains, living on steep slopes, areas prone to landslides, etc. There's a lot of construction that's very high risk. Of course, doing anything about this is a very politically sensitive issue. And yet evictions and the idea of relocation can very negatively affect the urban poor having to move, and the vulnerability that's created from that. Another example from Namibia. I do have other examples, but this was one of the communities that was affected by the flood. They actually had come across this master plan for the city, which is basically will mean that their community will be relocated to the outskirts of the city. And this is very much against what the community wants to do, but that the area is going to be developed for higher rent uses, and therefore they can make it actually flood-proof. So this is just an indicative example of something that's happening in many, many cities across the world. And maybe I'll skip that just for time's sake, but just to say that I think that in terms of the way people can actually build to cope with that, actually maybe I'll go quickly back here, just to say that in Bangladesh, for example, there's a national building code, but the way that people are building the way people can build, but given the land that they have available and the resources that they have available, doesn't necessarily match the building code. And so there needs to be a revision of all of these type of codes in order to build, and so there can be some sort of regulation and some sort of stipulations about what is safe and what is unsafe building. For example, in one of these small rooms here, in one of these houses, a whole family is living, and these actually aren't even on land, but are actually over the water. But yet people are making very interesting changes to their house. Like this drawing shows, for example, and this is in Corel, the houses can be raised or lowered depending on what the flood levels are going to be. And this is understanding from 1 year in to 1 year out how high the floodwater comes. And so there is ways of managing risk in informal settlements, even with or without regulations, but people doing this through their own coping. I won't go into too much detail about what's happening in Turkey because I think we have another speaker about that. But just to say, in Istanbul, there's a huge amount of the city has been developed informally in a city that has a very high risk of earthquakes. This orange shows the the informal settlements in the city. Yet there's a number of state-led mass housing projects that are being developed. So very high-density mass housing, trying to deal with the risk that's been developed through the informal settlements, because many of these informal settlements have developed to quite high density in areas that are quite high risk for earthquakes. So there's a lot of potential damage that could happen there. So one of the approaches is a state-led mass housing projects to try to deal with these risks. However, this is leading to a quite large displacement of people across the city. This shows the area is designated as regeneration projects in which people will not be able to stay in their area and will likely be evicted from there. For example, there's two examples. I have one in Sancaktepe, which is on the Asian side, quite sort of far out of the urban area, although becoming more urbanized all the time. One area that's deemed to be risk for flooding, in which the areas 100 meters of the river are to be removed. Yet this is very much against what people want, people who've settled there for many years. And they say that there isn't a flooding problem in the area. And another area in Karadolap in Istanbul, which is a designated area of regeneration in which this informal settlement is to be removed and replaced with mass housing that will be much safer for earthquakes. Yet the issue is that most of the people who are living there will not be able to afford the new housing that's built there and will thus be resettled on the outskirts of the city. So there's a lot of organization against these type of regeneration projects in Istanbul. And just to give one more example of a different approach to how to deal with informal settlements to what the approach I just mentioned, the Community Organizations Development Institute in Thailand has had for several years called the Ban Mong Kong Collective Housing Program. And the idea is for people who are living in informal settlements to form community savings groups that are then, once a level of savings is achieved, are supported by CODI for infrastructure and given loans to redevelop the areas and also help to find land either nearby or negotiating for land in the particular area. So it's a very collective approach to housing.
Cassidy, you've
yes.
in 2 minutes? Okay, thank you.
Okay. That can potentially have quite, and if this type of thing is scaled up, which is the idea that they're working on in Thailand, is that can potentially give much more secure access to land, and also there's been a new building code that's been developed for these type of housing developments, particularly to allow them to have less setback from the road, closer to each other, etc. That makes it less expensive. And so these kind of things all allow to increase resilience in informally settled areas. For example, areas that are at high risk of flooding that can be built up, as you see in this photo here. So just to close, a couple of closing remarks. I think that even in high risk areas, planning is still not well integrated with risk management, and this requires, from what I see in the cities, this requires training of planners. It requires more technical knowledge about how to do it, and also better information about risk, particularly about what are the potential for future events, and the need for regional level coordination in flood-prone areas. And this is not always easy because of political issues, I'll say that. And I think even places that suffer from frequent events, people don't necessarily think they can do anything about it and tend to see things as managing the event when it comes. And what we're talking about here, talking about planning, is really about forethought, and this takes strong political commitment. I just came back from Bangkok, and there's a lot of, they had a very large flood last year, but there's still the thought that, that was a one-off type of event, and that it won't necessarily happen for many years in the future. Therefore, we don't need to necessarily change what we're doing. And I think, thirdly, there are innovative solutions to about how to upgrade high-risk urban settlements, but more research is needed to make these practices more widespread. Upgrading of high-risk urban settlements is very time and resource intensive. Sort of mass housing approaches like what's happening in Turkey are probably more cost effective. But I think in terms of what you have as an end result of a socially just city, it's not in many cities not a very beneficial way. So other things are needed, other approaches are needed. And I think more research, just a general statement, is that more research is needed to understand what municipalities' needs are for improving planning, and advocacy is very important in this. Just to say that more research is needed in this area. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to your comments and questions, and I shall try to pass this back to Wim. Let's see.
Thank you. My applause for this excellent presentation, Cassidy. Very well structured.
Thank you very much.
I'm still just waiting to be the presenter again and pass it
okay.
on to the next person. Thank you very much. Everything is clear.
Good.
We have our three next speakers online. Tom of the CIB Secretariat helped me. I do see that Professor Murat is online, but I don't see an audio connection. Is he able to give a presentation at this moment? Tom? I also see Fatma El Mala.
Sorry. Suzanne Houston is online and also telephone connected. So for practical reasons, I think it's best that Suzanne gives her presentation.
Suzanne, are you able to make your presentation at this moment?
Yes, indeed.
Excellent. I'll make you the presenter, and you have to share your desktop and open your presentation. Cassidy, you have to make Susan the presenter, or Tom do so.
I will do.
Susan, you are the presenter now.
Yes.
Many thanks, Wim.
I look forward to your presentation. Susan is from the New Zealand Planning Institute, and she will present some preliminary results of a survey on resilience planning, not just in New Zealand, but across the Commonwealth. Susan.
Thank you so much. And welcome to all of you listening. The key term that was used by Wim was preliminary, and that's absolutely right, because the survey actually hasn't closed. It closes tomorrow. So there hasn't been time to analyse the results in great depth, but I certainly can give you the headlines of those results. The context of the survey was an invite from the Commonwealth Association of Planners to put together a working group that could come up with a quality evidence-based document that could be of value to CAP members in their understanding and practice of resilience planning. So that's the output we're aiming for. There's just 3 of us working on that. We developed an action plan. The deadline, which is driving it all, obviously, is September. And as I said, the survey closes tomorrow, and very little analysis has been undertaken so far. The survey was designed to elicit practices and views across the Commonwealth on disaster preparedness, especially in terms of land use. It's received responses from 17 Commonwealth countries, and they're listed there for you to see. So a healthy response. Interestingly, of those 17, just 10 Commonwealth countries completed the survey, and a great number of them sort of opted out for a short while when the question arose of whether there was a national or regional resilience strategy in place within their countries. So the following results very much reflect the responses from the 10 countries rather than the 17 who started the survey. And the first series of questions was about evidence and data that informs disaster preparedness decision making. Just 6 of the respondent countries had undertaken a risk assessment of those disasters that it was vulnerable to, and that the following slide shows the disasters that those countries had experienced over the previous 10 years. And as you can see, flooding is up there for all of them, followed by drought here, climate change, obviously, earthquakes, cyclones, rising sea levels, maritime disasters, oil spills, etc., extreme weather events, and tsunamis. We asked then what natural disasters they expected to occur or reoccur over the next 10 years. Again, flooding's up there. Drought significantly went up, so a great anticipation of that over the next 10 years. Rising sea levels, climate change became very prominent in the responses. We wanted to know whether the decision makers had the information they needed to make good decisions in terms of planning and land use. So we asked whether countries were able to access data on the economic, social, environmental and human cost of disasters in their country, or be able to tell us where the hotspots were in terms of risk. And the next series of questions relate strategy. So move from evidence for decision making to strategic decision making. Again, just 6 of the respondent countries possessed a national or regional resilience strategy. 100% of respondents believed a strategy at both the national and regional level was crucial to the well-being of their communities. 87% of those who had a strategy, of those 6, 5 who had a strategy indicated their strategy had both priorities and measures of success. That's a good thing. 72% of those with a strategy indicated it was aligned with other relevant documents and planning instruments, including spatial plans, land use plans. So that's a very good response. And 100% of respondents believe the strategy should inform local land use plans. So where they existed, there seemed to be a great deal of alignment, and the strategies appeared strong. In terms of developing those strategies, we asked which sectors had contributed to the development of the strategy, and as you can see there they included the various levels of government within their countries, including local, state, regional, national, land use planners, energy services, community infrastructure providers, business, insurers, education sector, and community sectors. So a very well-informed plan in terms of consultation. We wanted to know what legislative stature their strategy had, their resilience strategy had at both a national and a regional level where they existed. 66% of respondents indicated that the national strategy possessed legislative force. 60% indicated their regional strategy had legislative force. and around 80% of the respondents believe both national and regional strategies should have legislative force. We also want to know whether the funding that surrounded disaster planning was aligned with that strategy, and 72% of those who had a strategy said that there was alignment with the funding that sat behind it. We wanted to know from the respondents how prepared they thought their countries were for disaster and what barriers and opportunities existed for resilience planning. This is quite a depressing slide in my view. So just 50% of the respondents felt that their country was as prepared as it could be for a natural disaster event, and the other 50 felt it was prepared for some, but not all anticipated events. There are a number of issues that could be seen as barriers to resilience planning, and we asked which of the following would respondents consider a barrier in their country. Right up there was lack of funding in terms of responses, property values, which we all come up against. National leadership was identified, a lack of strategy, a lack of data for making good decisions, a lack of land use planning expertise in relation to disaster planning, property rights, and the governance framework, i.e. fragmentation and lack of alignment. Interestingly, it was national leadership over sub-levels of government that was identified by many respondents. When asking what suggestions respondents had for building more preparedness, national leadership was identified as one, coordinated and aligned approach was another potential opportunity, a strategy with legislative force that was aligned horizontally and vertically, with various plans and agencies and funding, more evidence and tools, research, as Cassidy was saying, and the mapping experience in the UK was raised on a couple of occasions by respondents. Greater input by planners into disaster recovery planning and aligned funding. So that's a very brief overview of the headlines of the survey. It's our task now to go away and do more thorough analysis of that survey and prepare a first draft of paper that will go to Christine Platt from CAP in the near future. And thank you for the opportunity to share the results of the survey with you. Hope you found it of interest.
We certainly did, Susan. Thank you very much. Will the final results be available to, let's say, the attendees of this webinar? Can we make it available?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, we can do that.
Okay, we have all the names and email addresses. We will facilitate somehow to disseminate the final results. Thank you very much. Could
Lovely.
you stop sharing your desktop and make me the presenter? If you make me the presenter, then I can give the ball to someone else. CIB Secretariat hosts. I still have Fatma and Murat online, but do they have audio connection? Are they able to make a presentation now?
I think they have audio connection, but unfortunately they have no telephone connection. And I was trying to sort out what the problem is, but I cannot solve it within the short time I had. So,
does it mean they cannot make a presentation at this moment?
Not orally, so that's the problem. The technical problem we are facing at the moment.
What we will do as information for the attendees, within a week or so, we will have all the recordings of all the presentations available, and you'll receive notice on where to access them. We will do whatever we can to include separate presentations made by the two presenters who at this moment do have those audio problems. I want to use a bit of the time still available to forward some of the questions. I have one for both presenters from Claudia Gonzalez Muzio, if I say it correct. I would like the presenters to discuss the role of state versus private sector, especially the investors, in promoting or reinforcing planning regulations in disaster-prone urban areas. So the role of the private sector also as related to the regulatory system related to disaster-prone areas. Cassidy, you said a little bit about that. Could you elaborate a little bit on regulatory systems and the role of both the state and the private sector there?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Yes, I think it's a very interesting question. And for example, I think one that the Global Assessment Report in 2013, so the next one, is very much focused on the role of the private sector. So I think there's a lot of people who are thinking about how can the private sector take a greater role in building resilience at the urban level, because obviously there are very limited capacities of governments in order to do this, and so there's a need to reach out and see what else is possible. And I think just to give a short response about what I know now, we're actually doing a paper particularly on this issue over the next few months about how the private sector influences local development decisions and what regulations can do about that. But I'll take actually an example that I got from Lee Boscher, which is that if you look at development in floodplains in the UK, and you understand how much development is actually happening in floodplains, I think in London, it's somewhere between 10 and 20% of new housing that's been developed is actually developed on floodplain areas. And much of this is coming from demand from the private sector for being able to develop in areas like that. And also, the private sector also has a very strong influence on where they decide to locate, for example, production facilities. And for factories and other things. I mean, it should be regulated by the government in some context, and of course it is the government that often allows this type of development to happen. But I think the question is, how is it possible to make it so that the private sector sees, for example, being in a safe location for building safely, how the private sector sees this as their responsibility, and how that sort of incentive could be created for the private sector to be able to take on those things themselves. And certainly there are things, perhaps through insurance mechanisms and things like that, that could be done.
Okay, thank you. So it's not only about regulatory systems, it's also about incentives in more general terms for an engagement of the private sector. Susan, would you have something to add to this answer of Cassidy on how to involve the private sector with or without a relationship with regulatory systems?
I think what I could say in response, as a learning from the survey responses that we've received, is that the strategic level is a great place for that engagement to start, so that the private sector buys into the strategy at that point, and then any legislation or statutory reforms flow on from there. And they, as I said, they've bought in at the very, very beginning. So for me, it seems that the more successful strategies and planning for disaster has got the private sector involved at the very inception, at the strategic level.
So it's an engagement at the strategic level, not far later when it focuses on only regulatory systems.
Well, I think it's engagement throughout, but I think the strategic level is a good place to start. with the peak organisations.
May I follow up to this question and ask whether there is a big difference between, call it, the developing countries and the developed world? Many of the examples are on cities and disaster risks in emerging economies or developing countries. What about the developed countries? What about places like Miami and London and Amsterdam and etc.? Do those countries or cities have strategies in place? Is there the awareness? Are there the tools available? Susan first.
Well, as I said, in the responses that we've received, there were just 6 countries that indicated they had a strategy. So they're not thick on the ground, and I think that is something that countries will want to look at as we go forward. Getting an aligned strategy that means that they're not the ambulance at the bottom of the hill. They're being very proactive about the way they plan land use.
Question to Cassidy. You mentioned the informal settlements. In many cities, they are a big part of the whole urban environment. And you say that there is a need for research on informal settlements and disaster risk or disaster risk reduction. Can you elaborate a little bit on that with the focus on informal settlements in the developing countries? Cassidy.
I think that it comes partly from a lot of the issues that are coming out regarding climate change and the sort of increased disaster risks that are coming from that. There's a lot of city governments that are struggling with what to do with these areas that have developed over the last 40, 50 years on hazard-prone areas, either on floodplains, on very steep slopes. And as I mentioned, for example, cities like Istanbul, cities like Dhaka, also Bangkok, these very large cities that have had huge amounts of informal development happening for many, many years, and some of it quite high risk of earthquakes. Like in Istanbul, for example, you have 4, 5, 6-story buildings that are at risk. So the issue is really how those kind of things. There are some very positive examples. I showed the example of in Thailand, the community, the Kodi example in the Ban Mong Kong project, which is not exactly related to disaster risk necessarily. It's just dealing with evictions and informal settlements. But there are examples of where communities together have managed to successfully negotiate to move to safer land. But this is something that I think cities see it very much as their responsibility, yet communities don't necessarily agree either that the risk is very high given what the options are, which are often moving quite far out of the city, and that they often feel that they would prefer to stay there and deal with the risk as it is. So there's a sort of mismatch necessarily between the priorities of government and the priorities of people who are living in informal settlements and trying to survive in the city. So I think that there needs to be kind of more look at what are the approaches to deal with that. And I think certainly it has to be a situation by situation approach, but also how can government programs help to perhaps finance communities to move or to upgrade, but yet not make it necessarily a forced kind of eviction or a massive new development project, which certainly negatively impacts all of those people.
I personally think that collecting good practice examples on how to deal with the informal settlements and engage them in the process would be an interesting priority for research. But that's my opinion.
I think that actually Murat Balamir, I was looking at both Fatma Al-Mahala and Murat Balamir, who aren't able to present, have some very interesting issues of that, and Murat Balamir has some interesting ideas of how to approach this. So
we will have them disseminated. I have 2 more questions. One from Jelly Mooring. It's about urban planning. I would like to ask the panelists how communities' participation are taken into account in urban planning, as most often the urban planning processes are top-down approaches. Are there questions about that, Susan, in your survey on the engagement of communities in urban planning, the formal urban planning processes?
No, it was the question there was very much about how you engage your community to develop a strategy and to inform your decision making at a strategic, big picture, the strategic level rather than at the land use level. So I'm not able to help with that one. What I can say I can say that as far as New Zealand goes, the community engagement is getting smarter and it is extensive, if that's of any help.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a question by one of our future presenters, Helena Molin-Valdez. Participation, planning, urban, strategic and land use, examples of incentives for including risk assessment and risk-sensitive planning. Are there models for those, and which of the models seem to be working better than others? Cassidy, you first. Mm-hmm. The better working models for participatory planning.
There are lots of models for participatory planning. Maybe not necessarily in the world of disaster risk and resilience, but there are examples of how different actors and sectors participate in plans through consultations, through multi-stakeholder planning processes and forums and things like that. But I think the issue is how to incorporate the risk into the planning process, and I think partly that's still there still in many cities still something that is not happening to a great degree yet, and I think that perhaps a lot of it has, from what I've seen in the cities that I've been looking at, has been more about technical knowledge. Like, for example, that planners need more technical knowledge on, for example, what is risk and how to read the maps, and how to deal with uncertainty in understanding. What is the potential for an earthquake, or the potential for a tsunami, or the potential for the next large flood, and how to deal with that uncertainty in terms of what they decide as priorities for land use planning.
We have a special question in this context from Amy Mentese. What can the role be of the NGOs in this, in providing community participation, in supporting that, in engagement, etc.? The special role of the NGOs. I think again, Cassidy.
I think that there are, for example, if you look at NGOs that are trying to support women's groups, for example, think about Istanbul. There's an NGO in particular there that's trying to support women's groups to look at community-based risk assessment. So it's a very small scale at this point. They're an NGO that's existed for many years, supporting women and children's development in Turkey, but they have moved into looking at disaster resilience. So what they've done in a number of communities, number of neighborhoods, is gone in and help women to do a community-based risk assessment. So they look around in their neighborhood, identify what are the potential areas of risk, such as gas stations, such as areas of contamination, such as floods or landslides, and to identify that and to use that as a basis for working with the municipality. So I think there's a real potential of NGOs to help with technical expertise and to help with people trying to understand what risk is. In all different scales, like and this not necessarily NGO, but an agency, for example, JICA from Japan is helping the city of Bangkok to develop an adaptation plan, so dealing with also hazard risk, and this is a kind of technical assistance for the cities. And then in Bangladesh, you have sort of massive NGOs that are doing all kinds of disaster management programs throughout the country. So I think they certainly can assist governments and assist communities in technical knowledge.
Okay. I think it's also a good question for one of the forthcoming webinars, and then maybe on the role of ISDR and how they can coordinate and facilitate those NGOs to play a role there. I have another question from Lilian Hobelka, focused or directed to Cassidy Johnson. Thanks for your presentation, she says. And she says that it seems to be implicit in your presentation that in developing countries often there are not or there were not planning regulations. However, in the same places, in the same countries where there were such planning regulations, they have not been able to prevent the occupation of risk-prone areas, maybe through those informal settlements. How can this same instrument of planning and regulations now correct these unplanned settlements? There's a little bit of a controversy in that whole thinking about the official regulations and the informal settlements, and then using the official policies with their regulations to deal with the informal settlements. You have a thought on that, Cassidy?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think the question is certainly a question that needs to be answered. I think that, planning is about the future. So planning is about doing things to change what's happening in the future. And I think that dealing with dealing with the risk in informal settlements can certainly be integrated into a planning approach. But in terms of having it as a sort of formalized approach is can be quite difficult. If you look at what they're doing in Istanbul, for example, there is a very strong planning approach to dealing with the risk in informal settlements, in terms of seeing them as regeneration areas that should be leveled and then rebuilt as areas of lower risk. This is one way to deal with it in a very top-down manner. But I think the question is how do you deal with planning in something that is a formalized thing in a very informal way? In some ways, like land tenure arrangements don't necessarily have to be completely formalized in order for an area to improve its infrastructure, to deal with floods, or in order for people to learn about safe building practices and things like that. And those could be part of an overall strategic plan for an area, yet not needing a formalized land structure.
Okay. I have one final question for both presenters, Susan and Cassidy. We do envisage those 4 webinars to provide outcomes that will lead into a research roadmap that ISDR and CIB will set up, distribute, disseminate, etc., to try to influence the world of research. Susan, would you have a thought on possible priorities for research? And I asked the question against one of your slides where you asked people in your survey what could help most to a better awareness and having a better system in place, where the first answer was leadership, the second was coordination, the third was legislation, and only then on the 4th place words like more evidence and tools, where you yourself said maybe research can play a role there. More in general, possible priorities in your perception for, let's say, the international research agenda.
I think the interesting thing was that so many people, at the point where I asked, are you able to identify the human, economic, social, and environmental costs of disasters over the past 10 years? So many people dropped out at that point. So I can only assume that was too hard a question, or that the data wasn't readily available, nor where the hazard risk was for them in their country. So for some disasters, but not all disasters. They had that information. So I think that that's a critical piece of research that needs to be undertaken, so that mapping occurs and they're aware of where the hotspots are and what the costs are in the past and what the cost will be in the future if those events reoccur as they anticipate that they will. And many of them do anticipate that they will have return flooding and return earthquakes, etc., etc. So that helps put into context whatever the cost might be right here and now to change the way things are done.
Okay, excellent. Insight in costs and other applications in defined hotspots in a way that convinces planners and decision makers. Cassidy, you have your personal thoughts about possible research priorities?
I think that Susan's point is very good, and I certainly agree that understanding the risk seems to be for cities a big issue still. As I said, this issue about informal settlements and existing risk and how to approach that, I think this is an area of work that is needed. And I think more generally trying to understand the capacities of cities to integrate risk into the planning system. And that probably works very differently in different countries. And so for understanding in different countries how that works and how different actors, for example, the private sector or NGOs or others, can assist that process. I think that those would be the three areas.
Okay. To all attendees, it will be half a year or so from now before CIB and UNISDR can publish that research roadmap based on recommendations like this and whatever comes out of the survey and the whole of this series of webinars. We do have your email addresses. We will make it available for you. We will make you aware that it is available, maybe to be downloaded somewhere. We have run out of questions. What I can say is thank you, Cassidy. Thank you, Susan. We hope we will be able to bring back Dr. Fatma El-Malla and Professor Murat Balamir from Turkey with their presentations and make them available to all attendees, either via a future webinar or as a separate mini webinar that we will record and make available. What I can say is that we will have a next webinar tomorrow focused on engaging multiple stakeholders in risk reduction. Multiple stakeholders that must include local communities, maybe communities of informal settlements if we follow up and build upon what we have been discussing today. Tomorrow we will be providing examples. I'm not really able to say best practice examples yet because we are not in that stage, but good examples in good cities that can be inspirational to many others. I hope you will join us again tomorrow. I thank you very much. I herewith close with again thanks to our both speakers. This first webinar, I'm looking forward to tomorrow's second one. Thank you all very much.